The master of Raven's Crest had no idea that the strange girl who had been stealing bread from his kitchens, sleeping in the hollows behind the walls of his east tower, and whispering prayers into the dark fractures of his castle, was the same person half the kingdom believed to be dead. And she intended to keep it exactly that way. Lira pressed her palm flat against the cold stone, feeling the distant thrum of footsteps 3 corridors away. She had learned the castle's heartbeat better than her own. Every creak, every groan of beams settling into ancient foundations, every draft that slipped through gaps only she knew existed. 2 years of living inside the bones of Raven's Crest had turned her into something more than a thief and less than a ghost. She was the thing that breathed between walls, the silence that moved when no one was listening. But tonight, something was different. The footsteps weren't following their usual pattern. The night guards rotated at the same hours, walked the same routes, paused at the same windows to gaze out over the moors. Lira had memorized them the way other girls memorized lullabies. But these footsteps were wrong, too deliberate, too slow, and they were heading toward the kitchen passage she used every 3rd night to take what she needed to survive. She held her breath. The passage she stood in was barely wider than her shoulders. It had once been a servant's corridor, 3 centuries ago, when the original castle was built, before the new wings swallowed the old bones and everyone forgot about the veins that ran between them. Lira had found the entrance by accident on her first desperate night, half frozen, bleeding from a ragged wound across her ribs, with nowhere left in the world to go. The castle had opened for her like a wound closing in reverse. It had taken her in. She pressed her eye to the crack in the stone and watched. A man stood in the kitchen, not a guard, not a servant. Lord Ravendorn himself, barefoot on the flagstones, dark hair hanging loose around his shoulders, wearing nothing but sleep trousers and an expression of absolute, infuriating calm. He was leaning against the long oak table where the cooks kneaded bread each morning. Arms crossed, head tilted slightly to one side, as though he were waiting, as though he knew. Lira's pulse slammed against her throat. She didn't move, didn't breathe. She had seen him before, of course, hundreds of times over 2 years, through cracks and gaps and narrow slits between stones. She had watched Lord Dorn move through his own castle like a man carrying something invisible and heavy. Watched him sit alone in his study long past midnight, staring at maps he never seemed to actually read. Watched him dismiss his advisors with a patience that clearly cost him something. Watched him press his fingers to the bridge of his nose when he thought no one could see. And once, just once, she had watched him stand at the window of the East Tower, the very tower whose walls she slept inside, and whisper something she couldn't hear into the rain. She knew his face the way she knew the architecture of the walls, every angle, every shadow. But he had never looked in her direction, not once, not until now. His gaze lifted, not to the crack she watched through, not exactly, but close enough to turn her blood to ice. "I know you're there," he said. His voice was low, not threatening, not even particularly loud. It carried the way stone carries sound, solid and unavoidable. Lira didn't answer. Her fingers curled against the wall. She could retreat. The passage branched 6 feet behind her. Left led to the cellars. Right led to the space behind the library fireplace, where the stones were warm enough to sleep against in winter. She could disappear. She had done it before. "You've been here a long time," he continued, as though she had responded. He uncrossed his arms and placed both palms flat on the table. "The kitchen staff think we have a very selective rat, one that only takes fresh bread, never touches the salted meat, and prefers the rosemary loaves." A pause. "Personally, I think the rosemary loaves are the finest thing this kitchen produces, so I can't fault the taste." Silence. He waited. She could see the rise and fall of his breathing, steady, unhurried. The kitchen fire had burned down to embers, and the low orange light carved his face into something that looked almost gentle, almost safe. Almost was the most dangerous word Lira knew. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, and quieter. "I'm not going to make you leave." She pressed her forehead against the stone. Her throat burned. 2 years. 2 years of silence and survival and learning to need nothing and no one. 2 years of watching this man's life from spaces he didn't know existed. And somewhere in the dark, honest hours of those years, she had begun to feel as though she knew him, as though the walls had given her something she never asked for: understanding. She knew he was kind to servants and cold to nobles. She knew he kept a hound with 3 legs that slept at the foot of his bed. She knew he read histories of wars that had ended badly because he believed in learning from failure. She knew he hadn't laughed, truly laughed, in all the time she had watched him. She knew she should run. Her hand found the edge of the stone panel and pushed. The wall slid open with a soft scrape that made him straighten. She stepped out into the kitchen, blinking against even the dim light, and watched his expression change. She must have looked terrible. She knew that without a mirror. Her clothes were stolen from the laundry, a servant's tunic far too large for her frame, trousers patched so many times they were more thread than fabric. Her hair was long and tangled, the dark red of it dulled with dust. She was thin, too thin. And she was standing in front of one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, barefoot on his kitchen floor, with absolutely no plan for what came next. His gaze moved over her, not the way men's gazes usually moved over women in Lira's experience, calculating cost and use. This was something else. This was careful, thorough. She watched his eyes catch on her wrists, bird-boned and bruised where she had scraped them navigating tight passages. Watched them find the old scar along her jaw. Watched something tighten in his expression, something controlled and quiet that looked like anger held on a very short leash. "How long?" he asked. 2 years. Her voice came out rough, disused. She swallowed. "Give or take." He stared at her. Then he exhaled slowly and rubbed one hand across his jaw, a gesture she recognized. She had seen him do it 1,000 times through 1,000 cracks in 1,000 walls. It meant he was thinking. "How's the rent?" he said. Lira blinked. He wasn't smiling. Not quite. But something at the corner of his mouth shifted. Something that in better light, on a better night, might have been the beginning of humor. The first she had ever seen from him. "Free," she said before she could stop herself. "Though the accommodations leave something to be desired." Then he did smile. Small, brief, but real. And something inside Lira's chest cracked like ice on a river on the first true day of spring. He pulled a chair out from the table and sat down, gesturing to the one across from him. She didn't move. "I'm not going to call the guards," he said. "If I wanted you caught, I would have sealed the passages months ago." "You knew about the passages." "I've known about them since I was 12. Used to hide in them when my father's moods turned dark." He met her eyes. "I didn't know someone was living in them until about 6 months ago. A footprint in the dust near the East Tower. Too small to be mine. 6 months." He had known for 6 months and hadn't come looking until now. Lira didn't know what to do with that. She sat down. He studied her face in the ember light. "You're running from something." It wasn't a question. She answered anyway. "Yes." "Something bad enough that living inside walls for 2 years seemed like the better option." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "There's bread in the larder and soup from tonight's dinner. Will you eat if I bring it to you?" Her pride said no. Her stomach said something else entirely. "Yes," she said for the 3rd time, and hated how small the word sounded. He rose without ceremony and moved through the kitchen with the ease of someone who, despite being lord of a castle with 50 servants, apparently knew where things were kept. He returned with a bowl of soup, still faintly warm, and half a rosemary loaf. He set them in front of her and sat back down. She ate. She tried to eat slowly, the way a person with dignity would eat. But the first taste of hot soup after 2 years of cold bread and stolen scraps broke something in her restraint. She ate like a creature starving, because she was, and she kept her eyes on the bowl because she couldn't bear to see pity on his face. When she looked up, there was no pity, just that careful, steady attention, and the anger again, not directed at her, but simmering beneath the surface like heat beneath stone. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. Her name was a dangerous thing. Her name was connected to a family that had been destroyed, a title that had been stripped. To a girl who was supposed to have burned in a fire set by men who wanted her father's land and didn't mind killing his daughter to get it. "Lira," she said. "Just the first name, nothing else." "Lira," he repeated quietly, as though testing the weight of it. "I'm Raven, and I know who you are." "I imagine you do. You've been watching me for 2 years." No judgment in his voice, no accusation, just fact. "You probably know my habits better than anyone alive." Heat crept up her neck. She stared at the table. "I didn't mean to. The walls have cracks." "They do." Another pause. "You can stay." Her gaze snapped to his. "What?" "Not in the walls. I have rooms. Empty ones. Dozens of them." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and the firelight caught the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "Whatever is chasing you, whoever is looking for you, they haven't found you in 2 years inside my castle. I'd say Raven's Crest has proven it can keep you safe, but you shouldn't have to live like a ghost to be safe. You don't know me. No. But I know what fear looks like. I know what survival costs. And I know that whoever you are, you chose my walls to hide in. And I would rather give you a door than let you keep living without one." The words landed somewhere deep, somewhere Lira had bricked up and sealed and refused to look at for years. She pressed her lips together hard and breathed through the ache in her chest. "I'll think about it," she managed. "Take your time." He stood. The room at the end of the east corridor, 3rd floor. It's been empty for years. The lock works from the inside. I'll leave bedding outside the door tomorrow. He turned to go, then stopped. Looked back at her over his shoulder. "And Lira, you don't have to use the passages anymore. But if you do, at least take the good cheese next time. You've been eating the cooking cheese. It's terrible." She almost laughed. It caught in her throat like a bird striking glass. But it was there. The almost of it was enough. He left. She sat alone in the cooling kitchen and pressed her hands flat on the table where his had been, and felt, for the first time in 2 years, the terrifying possibility that she might not have to do this alone. She didn't take the room the next day, or the day after. She watched from the walls as he left the bedding outside the door, as promised. Watched him check the hallway each morning, see the untouched bundle, and walk away without comment. On the 3rd night, she heard something that changed everything. She was in the passage behind his study, the one she had used 100 times to listen to him meet with advisors and settle disputes. But tonight, he was alone, and he was speaking to someone through the communication mirror on his desk. Lira pressed close to the crack and listened. "The fire at the Ashford estate," Raven said, his voice hard in a way she had rarely heard. 3 years ago. I want every record, every witness account, every name connected to the seizure of those lands." Her blood turned to ice. Ashford. Her name. Her family's name. The daughter was reported dead. The voice in the mirror replied, "Burned in the fire." No body was ever recovered. Raven's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Someone survived. I want to know who gave the order, and I want proof. Lyra's hand was shaking. She pressed it flat against the stone to stop it. He was investigating her family's destruction. He was searching for answers she had never been able to find on her own because she had been too busy surviving. The question burned inside her. Why? She stepped out of the wall. Raven turned sharply, his hand dropping to the desk as if reaching for a weapon before recognition caught up. Lira. She was trembling. She couldn't stop. Ashford. You're investigating the Ashford fire. His expression went very still. She watched the understanding move through him, watched him look at her. Really look. At the scar on her jaw. At the burn she kept hidden beneath her sleeves. At the way she flinched from sudden sounds and open flame. You're the daughter, he said softly. The one they said died. I didn't die. The words came out fierce, shaking. I crawled out through the cellars. I ran for 3 days. I hid. And when there was nowhere left to hide, I found your walls. He moved toward her slowly, the way a person approaches a wounded animal that might bolt. He stopped 2 paces away, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat, could see how his hands stayed open at his sides, deliberately unthreatening. I started investigating 3 months ago, he said. Irregularities in the land seizure documents, names that didn't add up. I didn't know it was you. I didn't know you were here. His jaw tightened. But I'm glad you are. Why do you care? The question tore out of her. My family's lands are 2 provinces away. It doesn't concern you. Because it was wrong. Simple. Absolute. The way he said it, without hesitation, without qualification, made something inside her chest loosen painfully. And because I have the power to find the truth, which means I have the responsibility to use it. She stared at him in the lamplight of his study, surrounded by maps and books, and the weight of the title he carried. Ravendorn looked like exactly what he was, a man who believed that power was a tool, not a throne. She had watched him for 2 years. She had learned him in fragments and stolen glances, and standing here now, face to face, close enough to touch, she realized that the understanding she had built through walls and cracks and silence had been real. He was exactly who she had believed him to be. I'll take the room, she whispered. Something shifted in his eyes. Relief, perhaps, or something warmer. Good. She moved into the east corridor room that night. The lock worked from the inside, just as he had said. The bedding was soft. The bed was real. She lay in it and stared at the ceiling and wept for the first time in 2 years. Because safety, true safety, was so foreign to her body that it registered as grief before it registered as peace. Over the following weeks, everything changed, slowly at first, then all at once. Raven brought her into the investigation. At first, she resisted, sitting rigid across his desk while he spread documents between them, unable to believe he was simply handing her the fragments of her own destroyed life. But he did, without conditions, without demands. He asked what she remembered and listened without interrupting. He cross-referenced her memories with official records and showed her where the lies were buried. Lord Velmar. The name surfaced like something rotten floating to the top of still water. A minor lord with ambitions far larger than his holdings, who had paid soldiers to set the fire and paid clerks to bury the evidence. Lyra's father had refused to sell the Ashford lands, so they had taken them by force and called it tragedy. I will bring him before the High Council, Raven said one evening, his voice quiet with controlled fury. Every piece of evidence, every witness. He will not walk away from this. Lira looked at him across the desk, lamplight pooling between them, and felt the pull she had been resisting for weeks, perhaps longer. perhaps for 2 years of watching him through walls and learning the shape of his kindness in silence and solitude. "Why are you doing this for me?" He set down his pen, met her eyes. "Because you deserved someone who would." He paused. She watched his throat work. "And because from the moment you stepped out of my kitchen wall, covered in dust and fury, starving and still standing, I have not been able to think about anything else." The air between them went still. "Raven," she whispered, "you don't have to say anything." His voice had gone rough. "You owe me nothing. I need you to know that." "I know." She stood, moved around the desk, and stood before him where he sat, looking up at her with those dark gold-flecked eyes she knew better than any face in the world. "I know I owe you nothing. That is exactly why this means something." She leaned down and kissed him. His hand came up to cradle the side of her face, gentle, so gentle, as though she were made of something precious and breakable. She felt the warmth of his palm against her cheek, the careful restraint in his touch, and the way his breath shuddered when her lips met his. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, a question asked in the space between two people who had both been alone for far too long. Then his other hand found her waist, and she braced her hands on his shoulders, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like the walls between them, finally, coming down. When they pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers. His eyes were closed. His thumb traced the scar along her jaw with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "I have watched you for 2 years," she said, her voice barely above a breath, "through cracks and crevices and gaps in the stone. I have seen every version of you that you show the world and every version you hide, and I have never seen a single one I didn't trust." He opened his eyes, and there it was, the expression she had never once seen in 2 years of watching through walls. Not patience, not control, not the careful steadiness of a man holding his world together alone. Joy. The tribunal took place 6 weeks later. Lira stood in the great hall of Raven's Crest, dressed not in stolen servant's clothes, but in a gown of deep green that Raven had commissioned from the finest seamstress in the province. She stood with her shoulders back and her scars visible, and her name, her full name, Lira Ashford, spoken aloud for the first time in 3 years. Lord Velmar sat across the hall. When he saw her, his face turned the color of old ash. He had paid to have her killed. He had believed it done. And now she stood alive, burning with a fury that had been building behind walls for 2 years. Raven presented the evidence with cold precision: documents, witness testimonies, financial records traced back to payments made to soldiers who had carried torches to her family's home. Every word was measured and devastating, a lord wielding truth like a blade. But it was Lira who delivered the final blow. She stepped forward, and the hall went silent. She spoke clearly, without trembling, though her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She told them about the fire, about the screaming, about crawling through smoke and ash while her home collapsed around her, about running until her feet bled and hiding until she forgot what sunlight felt like. "You tried to erase me," she said, looking directly at Velmar. "You burned my home and killed my family and wrote my name out of the world. But walls have ears, my lord, and I have been listening." The High Council ruled unanimously. Velmar was stripped of his titles and lands and taken into custody. The Ashford estates were returned to their rightful heir. That night, Lira stood on the balcony of the East Tower, the same tower whose walls she had slept inside for 2 years, and felt the wind on her face, and couldn't quite believe any of it was real. Raven found her there. He always found her. She was beginning to think that finding each other was simply what they did, through walls and stone and silence and time. He stood beside her, close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers, and looked out at the moors stretching dark and endless under the stars. "The council has confirmed the restoration of your title," he said. "Lady Ashford, officially. It doesn't feel real? It will." His hand found hers, their fingers interlaced, his grip warm and steady. "Give it time." She turned to face him. In the moonlight, his face was all angles and shadows, and she thought about how she had first seen him in ember light, barefoot in his own kitchen, asking a ghost about the rent. How he had left bedding outside a door for 3 days without a word. How he had handed her the broken pieces of her own history and helped her build something from the wreckage. "I love you," she said. The words came easily. They had been building behind her ribs for weeks, pressing against her sternum, rising every time he looked at her with that careful, fierce, impossibly tender attention. His hand tightened on hers. He turned fully toward her, and she watched the words land in him. Watched something crack open behind his eyes the way ice had cracked in her chest that first night in the kitchen. "I have loved you since you stepped out of a wall covered in dust and told me the rent was free." His voice was rough, raw. He lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles. "I have loved you since before I knew your name. I think I loved the ghost of you, the footprint in the dust, the idea that someone had chosen my walls, out of everywhere in the world, to feel safe in." She kissed him again on the balcony of the tower she had once hidden inside. With the wind pulling at her hair and the stars vast and indifferent above them, she kissed him until the word home rearranged itself in her chest and settled somewhere new. Somewhere shaped exactly like the space between his arms. 3 months later, Ravenscrest had changed. Not in its bones. The castle was too old and stubborn for that. But in its warmth, in the laughter that now echoed through its halls. Lira sat in the study that had become theirs, not his, theirs, reviewing correspondence from the steward managing the restored Ashford estates. Reconstruction was underway. Families that had been displaced were returning. The land was healing slowly, the way all wounded things heal when given patience and care. The 3-legged hound dozed at her feet. Raven sat across the desk, writing something she couldn't see, his pen scratching steadily against parchment. "You're staring," she said without looking up. "You're worth staring at." She glanced up. He was watching her with that expression, the one she had first seen on the night she kissed him. Joy. Unguarded, unreasonable, world-altering joy on a face built for severity. "I found another passage yesterday," she said, "behind the North Wing library." "Of course you did." He set down his pen. "Should I be concerned about what you found?" "Mostly dust, a family of mice, and a rather beautiful fresco someone painted on the interior wall about 200 years ago. A woman in armor, standing over a fallen city." His eyebrows rose. "In my own walls." "Your walls are full of secrets, my lord. I should know." She smiled. It still surprised her sometimes, how easily smiling came now, how the muscles remembered. He stood, circled the desk, and leaned down to press a kiss to the top of her head. His hand rested on her shoulder, thumb tracing absent circles against the fabric of her sleeve. "I used to wonder why the castle felt alive," he murmured against her hair. "Why it never felt empty, even when I was alone in it. I thought it was the history, the stones remembering everyone who had lived here before." She tipped her head back to look up at him. "And now? Now I think it was you." His eyes were warm, gold-flecked, and full of a love so steady it felt like architecture. "Breathing in the walls, turning my cold, stubborn castle into something it had never been." "And what's that?" He kissed her, soft and slow, and she felt his smile against her lips. "Home."